समुद्रस्य हिमाद्रश्चैव दक्षिणं वर्षं तद् भारतं नाम भारतीयत्र सन्तति।
नमस्ते। इतिहास का आज के एपिसोड में स्वागत। आज के एपिसोड में हम जानेंगे सरस्वती नदी के बारे में। हम जानेंगे सिंधु सरस्वती सभ्यता के बारे में।
इमं मे गंगे यमुने सरस्वती शुतुद्रिस्तोमं सजता परुष्ण्या असिज्ञा मरुद्रुधे पितस्तजार्जी एकेये शृणुक्या सुषोमाया।
We heard the recitation of one particular segment from the Rig Veda, from the 10th mandala of Rig Veda. This is known as the Nadi Stuti Suktam. Those verses mention 21 different rivers. There are different mandalas in the Rig Veda. This is from the 10th mandala. In the Rig Veda, the river Saraswati is mentioned more than 70 times. In the earlier mandalas, like for example the 6th mandala, the river Saraswati is a mighty river. By the time it comes to the 10th mandala, which is where that chant was from, it is one of many rivers and 21 different rivers are mentioned.
संस्कृति किसी भी राष्ट्र की रीढ़ और उसकी आत्मा होती है। भारत अपनी सांस्कृतिक विरासत के कारण ही विश्व गुरु कहलाया। संस्कृति यदि मनुष्य का आध्यात्मिक और भीतरी विकास है, तो सभ्यता मनुष्य का भौतिक और बाहरी विकास है। भारतीय सभ्यता की जननी सरस्वती नदी है और ये हमारी संस्कृति का भी अभिन्न अंग है। विश्व के सबसे प्राचीन और महत्वपूर्ण ग्रंथ वेदों का संकलन ऋषियों ने सरस्वती नदी के किनारे ही किया है। वैदिक काल में सरस्वती की बड़ी महिमा थी और इसे परम पावन नदी माना जाता था। ऋग्वेद में सरस्वती का उल्लेख 72 बार आता है और 3 स्तोत्र तो पूरी तरह से सरस्वती को ही समर्पित हैं। ऋग्वेद के नदी स्तुति सूक्त में अनंत, अखंड और प्रचंड वेग से गमन करने वाली सरस्वती नदी को यमुना के पश्चिम और सतलुज के पूर्व में बहते और पर्वतों से सागर तक पहुंचते हुए बताया गया है। भारतवर्ष के इतिहास महाभारत में सरस्वती नदी का उल्लेख कई बार किया गया है। अनेक राजाओं की ओर से इसके तट के पास यज्ञ किए जाने का वर्णन है। महाभारत के अनुशासन पर्व में इसे सभी नदियों में अग्रणी बताया गया है। सरस्वती नदी के तटवर्ती सभी तीर्थों का वर्णन महाभारत में शल्य पर्व में विस्तार से दिया गया है। इन स्थानों की यात्रा श्री कृष्ण के बड़े भाई बलराम ने की थी। जिस स्थान पर मरुभूमि में सरस्वती लुप्त हो गई थी, उसे विंशन कहते थे। सरस्वती नदी का कोई अस्तित्व रहा है या नहीं, ये बात धार्मिक और आस्था से जुड़े विश्वास के आधार पर नहीं, बल्कि ठोस वैज्ञानिक आधार पर प्रमाणित हो रही है। वैश्विक स्तर पर बेहद प्रतिष्ठित वैज्ञानिकों ने व्यापक अध्ययन करके इसकी पुष्टि की है। वर्तमान सूखी हुई सरस्वती नदी के समानांतर खुदाई में पुराने शहर मिले हैं, जिनमें पीली बंगा, काली बंगा और लोथल भी हैं। यहाँ कई यज्ञ कुंडों के अवशेष भी मिले हैं जो महाभारत में वर्णित तथ्य को प्रमाणित करते हैं। विश्व की प्राचीन नदी घाटी सभ्यताओं में से एक सरस्वती नदी के तट पर बसी सभ्यता को हड़प्पा सभ्यता या सिंधु सरस्वती सभ्यता कहा जाता है, क्योंकि जिस सिंधु घाटी सभ्यता की बात की जाती है वो ज्यादातर सरस्वती नदी के तटों पर बसी थी, न कि सिंधु नदी के तटों पर। किन्हीं कारणों से सरस्वती नदी के सूख जाने के बाद यहाँ के लोगों को इसकी सहायक नदियों की ओर जाना पड़ा। सिंधु सरस्वती सभ्यता का विकास सिंधु और सरस्वती यानी आज की घग्गर नदी के किनारे हुआ और कालीबंगा, राखीगढ़ी, हड़प्पा, मोहनजोदड़ो, धोलावीरा और लोथल इसके प्रमुख केंद्र थे।
इतिहास की धारा सरस्वती नदी की धारा से जुड़ी हुई है। आज जिसे हम घग्गर नदी कहते हैं वही वो विलुप्त हो चुकी सरस्वती नदी है जो भारतीय संस्कृति और सभ्यता की जननी है। इसी सरस्वती नदी के किनारे सिंधु सरस्वती सभ्यता पल्लवित और पुष्पित हुई। इस सभ्यता के प्रमुख स्थलों में से एक राजस्थान के हनुमानगढ़ जिले का यही वो कालीबंगा क्षेत्र है जहां हुए उत्खनन में सुनियोजित नगरों का विकास, कुशल जल निकासी व्यवस्था और पकाई हुई ईंटों के इस्तेमाल के प्रमाण मिले हैं, जो ग्रंथों और वैज्ञानिक विश्लेषण के अलावा इस सभ्यता के पुरातात्विक प्रमाण हैं।
इसको कालीबंगन को या किसी भी हमारे सिंधु सभ्यता के साइट्स को जो है वो सिंधु घाटी के नाम से ही जाना जाता था, लेकिन बाद में जैसे इनको सारे साइट जैसे कालीबंगा है और कोई साइट से जो सरस्वती पैलियो चैनल्स पे भी मिल रहा है, इससे हमें ये अंदाज़ा लग जाता है कि ज़्यादातर साइट जो है सरस्वती रिवर के किनारे बसे हुए थे। और इस साइट पे कालीबंगा का अगर मैं स्पेसिफिक बताऊं आप लोगों को तो इस पे 1961 से 1969 तक यहाँ पे खुदाई हो चुकी है। काफ़ी लंबा सीज़न था वो, और उसी के परिणाम हमें ये इतने अवशेष और ये फोर्टिफिकेशन वॉल्स और सारे ये प्रमाणित मिले हैं। तो अभी ये जिस एरिया पे हम काम कर रहे हैं, जैसे मेरे पीछे देख रहे हैं आप, एक्सकवेशन चल रहा है, वो KLB3 वाला एरिया है और उस पर पहले खुदाई हुई थी, लेकिन वो छोटा सा एरिया है, उसमें हमें फायर ऑल्टर्स मिले और कुछ रिचुअल पर्पस के सामान मिले हैं। तो अभी हम उसको थोड़ा और एक्सटेंड कर रहे हैं, तो इसी कारण से ये खुदाई चल रही है यहाँ पे।
रिवर घग्गर है, जो हमारी जो घग्गर नदी है, जो कालांतर में पहले जिसको सरस्वती नदी होती थी, जो अभी ये होकर के अब ये इसका नाम घग्गर हो गया, और जो कि शिवालिक रेंज से निकलती है और वहाँ से होती हुई पंजाब और हरियाणा में होती हुई और ये यहाँ राजस्थान में हमारे हनुमानगढ़ डिस्ट्रिक्ट में एंटर होती है। उसके बाद में आगे जाकर के पाकिस्तान में चली जाती है।
सिंधु सरस्वती घाटी सभ्यता के अन्य केंद्रों से भिन्न हनुमानगढ़ के कालीबंगा में एक विशाल दुर्ग के अवशेष भी मिले हैं, जो यहाँ के मानव द्वारा अपनाए गए सुरक्षात्मक उपायों का प्रमाण है। इसके अलावा दिल्ली मुल्तान मार्ग पर स्थित हनुमानगढ़ का भटनेर किला भारत के सबसे पुराने और मजबूत किलों में से एक माना जाता है। घग्गर नदी के किनारे बना करीब 1700 साल पुराना राजस्थान का ये भटनेर किला राष्ट्रीय महत्व के स्मारकों की सूची में शामिल है।
The river Saraswati declined over time. According to the texts, it disappeared in a place known as Vinashan. The place where I am standing is Kalibangan. Right behind me, you can see what used to be once the course of the mighty river Saraswati. Kalibangan is a place where excavations have been held. I am standing at a place which records the history of human habitation, which goes back perhaps even 6,000 years, certainly 5,000 years. What you see behind me is what remains of the Saraswati, the river Ghaggar. Saraswati is very much part of our culture. Every time we perform a rite even today involving water, we say, Gange cha Yamuneshchaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jale Asmin Sannidhang Kuru. Attempts have been made to trace the history of the Sindhu Saraswati Civilization. Some of you may have read Danino's book, in search of the lost river. We are rediscovering our Itihasa. In a short while from now, I will be in conversation with Sanjeev Sanyal, colleague, friend, economist, author, historian, geographer, to discuss River Saraswati and the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. I am joined by Sanjeev Sanyal, famous author of The Land of the Seven Rivers. Sanjeev, namaste. Welcome to the program. I like to think that where we are seated is not very far from where Saraswati disappeared, Vinasan. If not that, the confluence of the Saraswati and the Drishadvati. Tell us a little bit about the timeline of the river Saraswati.
So first of all, let me thank you for having me on this show. You're absolutely right. This is the riverbed of the Saraswati River, now known as the Ghaggar. What you see here is of course wide, but do remember that these bunds have been built only in the last 50 years. So the original course is much broader of this river. And this river has gone through many ups and downs. तो आप अगर आज से 90,000 साल पहले जाएंगे तो दिखेगा एक बहुत चौड़ा सा एक नदी यहाँ से बह रहा है. उसमें ग्लेशियल वाटर भी है और रेनफेड वाटर भी है. तो 90,000 साल से आज से 20,000 साल पहले तक यहाँ जो बहाव रहा है वो एक चौड़े बड़ी सी नदी जो यहाँ से बह रही थी उसी की एक बहाव है. उसके बाद 20,000 साल पहले आइस एज के वजह से यहाँ एक सूखा पड़ता है. तो 20,000 साल पहले से 9,000 साल पहले तक ये दिस रिवर then basically dries up to a very narrow flow. So do not think of the Saraswati as having had a even history. And while it does not disappear, the river loses two of its major tributaries at this time, possibly the Sutlej and the Yamuna that used to flow into it. Then the ice age ends about 20,000 years ago. Rain returns. Very likely the Sutlej again begins to flow back into this river. So this river again revives. तो फिर 20,000 साल पहले से 9,000 साल के जो सूखे के बाद 9,000 साल आज से 9,000 साल पहले मतलब 7,000 ईसा पूर्व से ये बहाव जो है इसमें फिर से वापस आने लगती है. और इस समय यहाँ बस्तियाँ भी बसने लगती हैं. तो जब हम कहते हैं कि ये सिंधु सरस्वती सभ्यता के बारे में कहते हैं तो इसकी जो शुरुआत है वो तकरीबन आज से 7,000 साल ले लीजिए और इसी सिंधु नदी और सरस्वती नदी के घाटियों में इनकी जो बस्तियां जो बनने लगती हैं. अब क्या होता है कि ये 9,000 साल से 4,500 साल पहले तक मतलब 2500 BC तक this river is in flow. It is mostly a river, a rain-fed river, although there may have been some water coming in from the Sutlej and maybe even some glacial water also coming into it. It's mainly a rain-fed river. Now, there is an impression that a rain-fed river would therefore not be somehow smaller than a glacial-fed river. This is absolutely not the case. All the rivers of southern India are rain-fed. Nile, Amazon, all these great rivers around the world are rain-fed. So, you can have a very large rain-fed river. And primarily Saraswati of this period, unlike the earlier period, is mostly a rain-fed river, but a very large rain-fed river. Remember, the climate of this area is wetter, and so it is flowing. Now, about approximately 4,500 years ago, मतलब 2,500 ईसा पूर्व में यहाँ हमको दिखता है कि यहाँ एक धीरे धीरे ये जो मानसून में जो बरसात है और वेस्टर्न डिस्टर्बेंस जो विंटर का जो रहन है दोनों घटते जा रहे हैं. और 4,000 साल पहले मतलब 2,000 ईसा पूर्व में यहाँ एक बहुत भयंकर सा सूखा पड़ता है. और भारत में ही नहीं, ये इजिप्ट में, सुमेरिया में, हर जगह एक बहुत भयंकर सा सूखा पड़ता है और उसके वजह से ये नदी लुप्त हो जाती है. तो यही जो बाकी रह जाता है ये घग्गर नदी है. आज भी जून, जुलाई, अगस्त में इसमें एक बहाव रहता है और काफ़ी भयंकर सा बहाव रहता है. लेकिन मोटा मोटा ये जो पेरेनियल रिवर है that
give us some idea of the size and the geographical expanse of, let me call it now, the Saraswati civilization, because often people have tended to think of it in terms of the Sindhu Savyata, but the Saraswati Savyata is much more wide. So give us a sense of that.
So most important thing to understand is that most of the Harappan sites are not on the Indus Valley, but on the Saraswati Valley. There are literally, over here we talked about Kalibangan, but there is actually almost a settlement, some urban, some rural, every few kilometers. So there are literally dozens upon dozens of these settlements along here. So this was clearly a very important part of that civilization, because this is where it hubbed. But to understand its scale and size, you need to understand the scale and size of the river itself. So where was exactly this river? Now, right in the beginning, you mentioned the Nadi Stuti Suktam. So the Nadi Stuti Suktam is very clear where the Saraswati river is. It is between the Yamuna and the Shutudru, which is the Sutlej. So there is no doubt, as far as the Rigvedic conversation is concerned, where exactly the Saraswati flowed. It's between these two rivers. Next, it clearly mentions also in the Rigveda that it flowed from the high mountains to the ocean. So we know that it's a river that flowed from the mountains to the sea. Now, is there a river today that fits this description? And the answer is no. And that is why we talk about the Ghaggar, because if you look at satellite photographs, it's very, very clear that there was this river, and ground proofing of all kinds and scientific studies have clearly shown that there was this great river in exactly the place where the Rigveda mentions it. So it is the Ghaggar river. It comes out of the Shivalik just north of Chandigarh, flows through today's Punjab Haryana border, comes into northern Rajasthan, which is where we are now. It flows then into Pakistan, and then flows back out into what is now the run of Kutch, which is now salt flats, but in fact was the estuary both of the Saraswati and on the Sindhu. The Indus used to actually flow into the sea somewhat east of where it does today. So the run of Kutch was actually a network of islands, including of course the famous site of the Dholavira, which is an island in the middle of this estuary. And the salt flats would have probably looked a little bit like the Sundarbans if you had come here maybe 5,000–6,000 years ago.
You've done a lot of work also on urbanization and the history of urbanization. Urbanization, of course, is correlated historically, certainly after settled agriculture, with rivers. So once the Saraswati dried up, once there was environmental change, what happened to the civilization? Did it move eastwards? Where did it go?
So obviously this is a matter of great debate, but it is important to understand the cycle it went through. So just when you say Harappan civilization, it's not one point in time. There are large numbers of early Harappan sites or even pre-Harappan sites that pop up in what is now Haryana. And incidentally, a lot of this is happening in that area between the Saraswati and the Dishadwati. The Dishadwati, just like the Saraswati, there's a dry riverbed, we now call it the Chautang.
And it separated Kurukshetra, so to speak, from Kuru Jangal.
Yes. So there in this space, you have these early or pre-Harappan sites also popping up. Then there is a phase about circa 3500 BC, that's 5,500 years ago, when there is a clear increase in the number of settlements, which are called the early Harappan sites. Again, there are some that are popping up in the Indus Valley, some are popping up in Gujarat in the estuary area, but a dramatic increase in what is now Haryana and northern Rajasthan. And then of course you reach the mature Harappan period, which is basically between 3000 and 2000 BC. That is the period. So mature Harappan actually is not a very long period. It is a little over 1,000 years when these big cities come up. And then about 2000 years ago, about 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago, you can clearly see these cities suddenly go into a decline. And it correlates, as it happens to be, with this river system basically drying up. And of course the Mahabharata mentions very clearly the drying up of the river when Balram goes on his pilgrimage. And then this complete drying up happens, these settlements are, interestingly, most of the settlements seem to follow the river as it dries. They move further and further closer to the origins, which is towards the Shivaliks. So what's happening, this river is clearly no longer flowing, climate is changing. There are, interestingly, a bunching of these settlements of the late Harappan, interestingly, in the deep desert. And it appears that in some places the Saraswati converted itself into a series of lakes for a period of time, and there are clustering of these settlements in the deep desert. They also disappear, and then this civilization fully disappears. Now, what happens to the people of this civilization? Now, do remember that in the rest of India is not empty at this stage. Because of this obsession with the Harappans, we forget that the Indo-Gangetic plains was also occupied by a related civilization at the same time. Many of the digs, for example, in Sanauli have shown that they were also an advanced civilization with their own chariots and so on. There are already emerging cultures in the Narmada area, even in the Godavari area, and so people from these dying cities sort of spread out here. Some of them continue to live in this area in a increasingly rural setting. So while the cities decline, they continue to live, and it's interesting how they adapt to this also. So their food, for example, shifts from rice and wheat, which is water using, to bajra, jowar, and so on. So there is a scattering of people. There is also a continuation of some rural culture that continues for hundreds of years after the cities have disappeared.
So how does this fit into our understanding of the timeline of India's history? There's a lot of evidence, nonetheless this myth never seems to quite go away. There was an Aryan invasion, and there was a Dravidian civilization which was destroyed as a result of this. So how does all of this fit into that timeline?
So this is an evolving area of knowledge. So remember that history is also an evolving field. So there's lots of new evidence from archaeology, from genetics, from of course ground proofing, satellite photographs. So we have very good idea now of timelines, although we are not entirely sure how it correlates with our textual evidence yet. But here is the archaeological and other evidence. First of all, there is no evidence of a large scale one-time Aryan invasion that leads to the collapse of these cities. That is clearly climate related and driven by other factors, and it takes hundreds of years for this decline to happen. Secondly, remember that just because we have this idea that something was very far away in the future, it's somehow some sort of a pure culture. This is also not the case. While there was a degree of standardization across this Sindhu Saraswati civilization, you are talking about people, there's large amount of variation over time and geography. And they are continuously trading, migrating and so on with surrounding cultures, the Indo-Gangetic plain on one side, but also on the other side with Afghanistan, through Balochistan, which by the way during the wet period was traversable by people, it was grassland, and they are trading also with the Middle East. So there's lots of migration happening. So when you think of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, do remember that it is not a pure civilization. And just because we happen to have the texts of one branch of that from this area, from the tribe that we call the Bharata, that they call themselves the Bharatas, do not think that the other parts did not have their own cultures, ideas, languages, or at least dialects. So this mix and mash is what we would call is the culture. There's lots of regional variation, there's lots of variation, and yes, this is a mixed group. Some of them may well have been Dravidian speaking, who knows. Some would have been Vedic speaking, as we know they were probably from this area.
What about the script? How much has been done in terms of deciphering the script, or was there more than one script?
Well, one thing is known is that the Harappans did share a script. Now there may have been variation in it, but the seals do provide some amount of sort of these writings. The problem is we haven't deciphered them. There are many attempts and there are many claims as well, but nothing that we can say for sure or correlate it to a language. So even if we understand that this is a script that it goes left for right or right to left and even some meanings, we are still quite far away from correlating it to a specific language.
You mentioned the genetic evidence. What does the genetic evidence tell us?
The genetic evidence suggests that these people, that Indians in general, by the way, are an extremely mixed bunch of people. So first of all, even in ancient times, if you are talking about the people of the Vedic people, do not think of them as some pure race. Some of them are related to people more southern. There are also groups of people who are called the Mundas, who come in from Southeast Asia. So there are lots of genetic mixing going on, and there is migration going on.
In this part of the country, excavations now primarily are Rakhigari and Kalibangan.
Yes.
We've come to Kalibangan.
Yes.
So let us now go with Sanjeev Sanyal to go and take a look at the excavations in Kalibangan. From the site of the bed of the Saraswati Ghaggar in Hanumangarh, we have now come to where the excavations in Kalibangan are taking place. The mounds are right behind us. Sanjeev, please tell us about these mounds. What are these mounds?
These are the mounds of Kalibangan town. It's a Harappan settlement, and these are the mounds that you can see right here is of the lower town. There is an upper town further down, and these are now being excavated again. They were excavated in 1962, and a lot of interesting things were found there. For example, Vedic altars. Very often the old idea was that the Harappans had nothing to do with the Vedic culture. That is absolutely not true. There are actually Vedic altars have been found in many sites, including in Kalibangan. And as you can see, this is a very extensive site, not as large as Rakhigari, but still would count as a very extensive site.
So all of these excavations essentially are telling us that, as you have also written, that there wasn't one single concept of India or Bharatvarsha. There were many separate cultures coexisting, so to speak.
At this early stage, very likely, and if you correlate this with the Vedic literature, you can see that the idea of Bharat at this stage is really consists of the area that they used to call the Sapta Sindhava. It was the homeland of the Bharatas. And the Sapta Sindhava is basically the Saraswati and its 7 tributaries. And they are again talked about in the Mahabharata as well. However, that does not mean that there was no wider culture going on. Of course, there was the Saraswati Sindhu culture itself, which was a wider culture. And then there was other cultures which were trading and related in various ways in the Gangetic Plains, in peninsular India, west of India and so on, and they were trading and had connections with each other. But what happens is that in the Rig Veda, the idea of Sapta Sindhava correlating merely to the Saraswati and its tributaries, over time that idea begins to expand. And so what turns out to be the Bharata of the Mahabharata already begins to hint to a wider landscape. And then by the Puranic literature, when you have the chanting of the Sapta Sindhava or the 7 rivers, it is enumerated in a way that clearly includes the Ganga, Yamuna and Saraswati, but also the Godavari, the Narmada, the Kaveri and so on. And you of course know the particular chant, if you will chant it out.
Gange cha Yamuneshchaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jale Asmin Sannidham Kuru. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you very much for joining us in this episode of Itihasa, explaining to us about the Saraswati river, the Sindhu Saraswati Sabhyata. I hope you liked this episode on the river Saraswati and the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. We are ending this episode in front of Kalibangan, where the excavations have happened, are still going on. This is part of our heritage. This is part of our legacy. This is part of our Itihasa, which is why we showed it in this particular episode. आशा है सभी को अच्छा लगा होगा। अगले एपिसोड में हम जानेंगे नेशनल मॉन्यूमेंट्स अथॉरिटी के बारे में, जानेंगे नेशनल मॉन्यूमेंट्स के बारे में, बात करेंगे विद द चेयरमैन ऑफ द नेशनल मॉन्यूमेंट्स अथॉरिटी तरुण विजय जी।